Thank you all for coming. It looks like we have a really big group today. My name is Margaret Johnson. I am the interim coordinator for the program for instructional effectiveness. And I really want to thank you all for being here today. I do want to mention that we are recording this session and it will be available on the PI website within a few weeks. Today's event is being co-hosted by the Diversity Resource Center, and I'm pleased to say that we're joined by Khalil Azizi from the Resource Center today. Thanks for your participation in this event. We much appreciate it. And today's session will focus on creating equitable classroom environments. And I'm delighted that we have 3 speakers today. They are Samantha Blatt from Anthropology, Nishan Borden from Counseling, and Mona Hearn from College of Education. Each of our presenters today will start off with their thoughts about how to best create equitable classroom environments. And once the 3 of them have completed their presentations, we will open up the session for questions and discussion. And we're looking forward to lots of great ideas from all of you who are here today. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and have us get started. And I believe Sam is the first one up.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here to continue to talk about inclusive teaching and how to make our environments better for our students. And so I'm an assistant professor in the anthropology department. I'm a biological anthropologist. And so some of my thinking goes towards that direction, working in North America and from the biological framework. And so some of my examples are from that. So there are a lot of ideas about what inclusiveness is. And so I'm really going to talk about it from my perspective and how I've used inclusivity in the classroom. And my 2 examples here are from 2 different communities, a community of students that are blind or low vision students, specifically in how I can involve them in STEM, and more specifically how I've faced challenges in my anthropology introduction to biological anthropology class and the lab component of that, which is a general ed class. And the second community is that of Indigenous students. And there are similarities between these 2 communities and many that we might want to have inclusion for. And those really fall into the spectrum of these are marginalized and generally underrepresented students. They come from cultural backgrounds that are different and perspectives that are different from a lot of students in the classroom, and that through their education, there have been gaps in their learning experiences that don't necessarily accommodate them coming into the normalized Western classroom. There's generally a lack of mentors that they have prior to even coming to a university. And for instructors, there's a lack of awareness and of the resources and their particular needs as well. And so that's kind of where my background coming into these examples is from. And so I'm gonna give some little tiny background of their perspectives and then mostly focus on how I've put this into practice, how I've tried to have these students included by giving you some examples that I've used in the classroom that I think actually work for all students and both of these communities as well. And then give you some of those collaborative resources that I've actually worked on. And so my idea of inclusive teaching is really centered on having students have that feeling of belonging, and from that, helping them engage in the classroom, which should help them hopefully achieve and then retain them so that they can graduate and reach their educational goals. And most students seem to leave school because of things that we might be able to change as far as inclusive practices, things like unhappiness or being made to feel like their needs and values are being approached by indifference. And so these are things that relate to this sense of belonging that is really important for my understanding of inclusive teaching. And so incorporating or providing an outlet for their values and their particular cultures and backgrounds and perspectives might be able to aid in their belonging and then engagement. I use a lot of anecdotes about struggle that everyone shares, and really anecdotes about struggle and issues that anybody has in life, especially in regards to education, starts at the top. And what I mean by that is the instructor. And so I'm generally very open about my own struggles in various forms, because it seems to open that up and make it normative for other students. And as well as trying to create affinity and self-awareness of all students and really understand the place and space that they're in to make that relevant to them, and then bring out a comfort level that essentially will work with engagement. And so that's a general overall of where I'm talking about. And so inclusiveness is also needs to be intentional. So you need to start off really thinking about it. I sort of fell into some of these things, and you can do off the fly changes in your course. But it really should be something that's intentional. And the first way you can do this is by self-reflection of your own biases and stereotypes. And one thing that can help, and this can help other students too in courses, is this Harvard implicit bias assessment, which you can just do online. And there's various groups in which you can do these quizzes. And at the end, it sort of tells you which group you have biases towards. And so even if you don't notice that you have biases, everybody does. And so it can bring us down to more of an even playing ground if you have sort of a quantitative way of saying, yeah, there are these things that I haven't been open to or haven't realized. And so avoiding making assumptions about our students backgrounds based on everything from their names to what their clothing is and from where they're from. You absolutely need to do that, and they need to sort of get in a position where they can do that themselves in the classroom. I try to convey confidence in them, give them a benefit of the doubt initially. Try to have them be collaborative parts in the classroom where they can contribute themselves to things that are or are not working. Don't treat students as monoliths to whatever group they are from. Don't make examples of them. This is a good example is from the one community I'll talk about as Indigenous students, looking at an Indigenous student and saying, well, you can tell us all about this. That puts them on the spot. It stereotypes what their experience is. And in that vein, you can practice perspective taking with students with various assignments where they, even if it's as simple as playing devil's advocate. And this all begins at the door of the classroom or at the door, where you say hello. You make sure people know who you are as the instructor, but that they understand that they're there. Learn their names if you can, depending on the size of the class, but start it immediately. And so that it's not just a person isolated in front of the room, but trying to build a community from that and belonging from that. Syllabus obviously is another intentional way that you can have inclusivity. So what are the norms of how students should be talking to each other? And I'll give some examples of that. A land acknowledgement and an acknowledgement of resources for students that are impacted by certain strains and stresses during the class is a pretty simple but very intentional thing to have. I'll show you mine in a few slides. You should also talk about, it's okay if you're sick or if there's a holiday. I want to know what's happening so that we can work through absences or work through missing of work. And for me, I usually have to say this many, many times before students will actually approach me with things that are happening in their lives. Even explaining office hours, and on the syllabi, I actually try to do that now, where I say office hours means I'm sitting there waiting for you to come speak with me about what it is you need to speak with me about, that you're not invading my space or my time, because not everybody understands that. It's not, a universal thing that students come in knowing. And so this is one of my examples from one of my syllabi of my inclusivity statement. Things like if you have another name or you use certain pronouns, or if there are parts of the class where you know, you have a perspective that is different than ours and we're not including that, like, just let me know at any time during the class. Because even in a science class like this is from, you know, there are perspectives, and science is created by people that have their own backgrounds. And so that is part of trying to understand science, is understanding who's writing the science. And so I try to make them feel comfortable with speaking about that. So my first community here is I basically had my first blind student attend my lab course, and he had other classes where he wasn't successful and accommodations weren't made for him. And blind and low vision is the most common disability, and there's a range within that disability, but there's also a range of assistive technologies that I didn't know about, that I assume most instructors do not know about. Everything from magnification to kinesthetic technology can be used. But unless you research it and try to incorporate it in other ways in a normal sense, you won't know about those things. They're definitely marginalized and underrepresented, particularly in STEM. And that is because sciences are generally thought as being very things that you need to observe. And so most of the teaching involved with STEM are based on observation. And so it creates a lack of materials. And in anthropology, this is really heightened because although there are materials and reflections about how to incorporate blind and low vision students into lab classes in other disciplines, I found that doesn't exist for anthropology. And so I was kind of up against trying to figure that out on the fly with this student. And it ended up being a very good and helpful challenge for me. And so these are just examples of some of the things I use and then exist for you to use. There's a lot of graphing and things and drawing that can happen in a lab course, and raised bar graphs and things like that do exist. There's also instances where the student can draw on certain pads where the surface will be lifted. And so a lot of my focus began being how can I make this class as tactile as possible. Lucky for me, the class is already very tactile because a lot of what we do focus on casts when we're talking about primate and hominin evolution. Some of the more difficult points were when we're talking about genetics, and I sort of made models of this before I realized you can go out and buy them. But there are very tactile models that are you can manipulate and change according to your teaching needs of DNA and things like that. You can buy Braille calipers. You can buy talking tape measures. You can buy the Novit Falcon, which you can use software and create games and applications for, that is haptic, where you're not just they're feeling things that you don't necessarily have in the classroom, but also getting the sense of motion as well. And so I used a lot of combination of Braille and lifted images in order to sort of depict those things. Another thing that I used, and I'm part of the class, was observation of behavior, of primate behavior. How do you have a blind student observe that? And so I changed that into being more an observation of sound. And so the student was able to hear different sounds and different calls of primates, match them to certain behaviors, and be able to actually record differences in pitch and wavelengths of sound as well in a free software. And so he did this with a paraeducator, but there are ways that with screen readers that the student can be more independent as well. This is another example of the use of these casts, and he actually got way better than most of the sighted students at this. And the way that I integrated this first, because he had no concept of really the placement of bones in the body, was to have him use his own body. And so say, like, you know where your arm is, you can always touch that and relate that back to the actual physical object in front of him. And so we were able to look at really specific traits on bone, not just differences in size and shape. And he was able to identify different bones in the body. We used magnetic skulls as well. This happened to be around the time of Halloween. So there's plenty of those plastic skeletons around. And so with the help of disability services, we created this basically a mini skeleton that he could take home with a Halloween skeleton that led to Braille labels where those bones were so we can get an overall picture first. I also tried to do things that were tactile as far as chromosomes, because it's a really difficult thing to just describe those and how they work in creating variation. And so I tried to make on the fly objects that were you could manipulate and change and feel texture for. And so a lot of this was based on texture and comparison of actual objects. And so overall for this, certainly the first thing that's important is orienting the student to bench safety in the laboratory and taking the extra time to do that. You do have to get creative a little bit. Using pipe cleaners and beads is one way. It doesn't have to be expensive. You don't have to buy all of these things. This is the infographic I made to sort of help other instructors get to that process of ideas that they can use, and a lot of links are involved, and I'll give you more resources after this. But para-educators, student help is really great, but I found that it's way better to try to involve all students together. They should be working together in a lab group, and it shouldn't matter if they're sighted or not. They learn better from each other than just using an outside para-educator. And so designing things that work for sighted and non-sighted students work the best, and it helped the student feel like they did belong in that class and that they could make friends in that class. And so modifying for all and not just one. Not all blind or low vision students know how to read or emboss images or versions of Braille. And so that does need to be taken in consideration for how creative you can get. And anything you can provide that's take home, like that skeleton, really works well too. And trying to assess as much as you can after. And the best way for me with like a single student is really to just be open about asking, hey, is this working? Like, be really honest. If this isn't working, what are the things that have worked for you in the past? And really how they're feeling overall in the class as well. So moving on to indigenizing. So first, indigenizing is really an action verb. Again, it has to be something that you have intent behind. Creating an environment where Indigenous peoples don't have to give up what they are to fit into that environment, that they see themselves reflected in the education system in the classroom, and that it is relevant to them. And it absolutely part of that is acknowledging links between history and current social reality for them. It's not always going to be comfortable for instructors or for some other students, but this is the kind of discomfort that can lead to changes and openness that will make certain students feel like they can belong, because it's not just about the singular group, but how everybody has faced these feelings. And so really the point of indigenizing is creating an environment where things can be valued from looking at an Indigenous perspective. So the real need here is a general distrust of these Eurocentric higher ed based on European values that are not generally Indigenous values or don't incorporate Indigenous values. It can be pretty unfair because these are unfamiliar learning styles that look at proficiency levels that are different than what Indigenous students and teachers, how they present learning. So there's a failure, of course, to include some of historical trauma and worldview as well throughout a course. And so students will feel ignored. And because the material that might be taught isn't taught in a way that can be presented as relevant to Indigenous students that like to take their education and use it in their own communities, you might have low retention just because of that, because it's not seen as something that is valuable in their world. It also, going away to college isolates people from their community, which they feel responsible for. Creates some circumstances where they might have ethnic hostility or face challenges according to transportation or socioeconomic status, or having families that they have to take care of. All of these things that some students just might not face. And a whole lack of Indigenous role models as well in the education system. Indigenous faculty teaching Indigenous students, and so they don't see themselves there necessarily. So I like to use this learning model created by First Nations in Canada and who actually have a lot of pull and say in how the Indigenous worldview is presented in educational environments in Canada. And so this is just one of many of these types of models. And it relates to this first practice of indigenizing, which is interconnectedness or holism, where you really work with the concept that there are connections between all different varieties of knowledge, and that knowledge is connected to each other, that it's a cycle and lifelong, and the place in which knowledge is gained and retained is important. And concept maps in general can be useful for learning and for Indigenous students because of this sort of model. And this model essentially is saying that you have, for these roots, you have very many sources of knowledge. So community, self, family, ancestors, the nation, languages, environment, all these are sources of knowledge. And leading into branches and leaves, these are the different expressions of knowledge that you can get from these sources that are all modified and molded and created through the lifelong cycle from all these different types of guides. One of which is teachers. Other guides are individuals like elders and other counselors and other mentors as well. And so this again is, and there's even more to this model than I'll speak of here, but it's a very intricate model that has really helped me to understand how to relate everything to each other and relate it to the personal information of the student, because that is literally how that is the importance of education to many Indigenous peoples. So going along with what Indigenous pedagogies are, this is really highly related to that model as well, using all senses and being demonstrative and relating things to each other, and not just trial and error, but observation of what works and what does not is generally how Indigenous students learn. The sense of community is extremely important, and the interconnectedness of community with the student and the learning, and land and history of the land and ancestors of land is extremely important. Going along with that, you have to understand that leadership typically among Indigenous communities is not just horizontal, but rather vertical. And so reciprocity in learning is also important, where listening is as important, if not as more important than talking. And so this goes both ways for students and for instructors. Listening and taking the time to hear out an anecdote of a student that maybe you know right away relates to the concepts you're talking about is important for their sense of belonging, and is a different way of expressing their personal knowledge. Along with this, you might have elders of the community in your courses, and recognizing them as elders is also really important to maintaining the community in the class for Indigenous students, because there's a level of respect and a level of knowledge that they are considered to have. And so if they are not sort of respected in that way by the instructor, it can cause kind of confusion and by the students, the elder, and really block that belonging, that sense of belonging. And also need to realize that, and this happens in some of my classes, not all knowledge is meant to be shared with everybody. And so recognizing that some knowledge is personal and sacred, and that you have to have permission or certain situations in which the knowledge is shared is important. So not poking at a student to tell you about the burial practices of their community is pretty important. They can share it if they want to, but there are certain things that are not meant to be. And so respecting that when it comes to different assignments is I find to be really important. So some things that I've used, this incorporates for really all students. So students to develop their own discussion rules. One of the first things I do is have them get together and talk about what a good discussion is, what a bad discussion is. What do you do if you're afraid to talk in class? What should the rules be for discussion in general? and rotating roles during discussion as well. So not everybody is always doing the same thing, and you have to go into different modes and they can show their different strengths for those. Integrating food is always good and appropriate when indigenizing. It's always good and appropriate, period, from what I say. So again, these are things that that are appropriate for all students and include all students. You should reflect in your syllabus on the choices of readings and topics as well. And so probably many of you have heard of decolonizing your syllabus at this point. And so including authors and topics, or letting students have some insight into that and bringing in some of things that, you know, reflect their background can be really helpful. Not just having, you know, the regular seminal authors all the time is a way of making everybody feel belong, but it also is just better to open up to the entire class, different ideas, and look at the history of some of these concepts as well. And reflective responses. Typically at home, a lot of Indigenous students are taught or emphasized you have to perform these tasks correctly or make a really good attempt the first time. And so you have to give time to students to think about what their answers are going to be. And from my background, my experience, some Indigenous students will never talk in class unless you give them the time they need to reflect correctly on what it is they want to say, because that is just not how they learn how to do that. And so giving them extra time or putting people into groups to talk without being on the spot works better. It's not an intentional thing where the student is coming into class and doesn't want to talk. It's just that they want to say the right thing, and maybe they need extra time or a different type of technique in the classroom to help that work. Storytelling, also extremely important among Indigenous communities, teaching lessons through narratives. And you can incorporate this in classes and case studies, or biographies, or fiction, or oral history, or comic books, different things, different ways that you can incorporate storytelling, or how stories have assignments in which they incorporate storytelling themselves. Particularly connection between the historical perspectives of what are being talked about in a class and connection to land. Another thing that I found from my background in archaeology too is that people need to start thinking about some of the words, the terminology that is, you know, used often and can be very harmful, and even if it's unintentional. Things like referring to Native American ruins or this abandoned city. These are terms that make Indigenous peoples feel like they don't exist in the world today, and that their culture and their community is some old, long ago thing that isn't vibrant and active today, or makes other people have stereotypes like that, and that's just simply not the case. And so you put off people pretty quickly when you talk about them as in the past tense only. So other things that I've done that I use for all students, but that are based on some of these ideas of indigenizing and inclusiveness, are assignments that are accessible and allow multiple means of engagement and expression. And so one of the simple ways that a lot of people have done is these student choice boards, where students have choices of the types of assignments that they'll do, like little things that are informal and low stakes, but they have choices in what it is. And it doesn't have to be this essay written this way on this topic, but another way for them to express the knowledge that they know from the classroom. And so I do this in a couple of different ways. I do a version of a student choice board, which is I call it choose your own adventure, where I have a multitude of these low stakes assignments for different modules in the course. They can choose what they are, what they want to do. It's really up to them. And they're things that involve a lot of creativity as well. And so it's a way of not expressing, oh, you can do this math, or you can do this complicated genetics, whatever, in a lab class, but it's a way of them showing the things that matter to them and expressing it in a way that is meaningful. And so this translates also to the essay that I also use a lot, where I get tons of different examples. These are just some examples from my classes of essays, everything. And this is a cake down here, by the way, just to talk about food and something that's relevant to my class, the skull cake. But art in different mediums, these are associated generally with a statement about the purpose behind it, and so they do express knowledge about it, but they essentially choose a medium to express knowledge versus just doing tests. Yes, they do exams, but exams don't show me everything. Objective things don't tend to show me everything that the student knows, everything that they learned, or give them a way of expressing themselves to me what they've learned. I've also used outreach and service learning activities for this. In my class right now, they have to come up with an outreach project, essentially, to again make this relevant to them and to their overall community. Things like looking at writing for content rather than just standard academic normal language can be helpful, as well as allowing for multiple dialects to be in their writing and in the discussions, because none of these are wrong. They're just different from academia, and so a lot of people don't feel comfortable bringing in or talking about their backgrounds if they can't talk about it in their own language per se. And this sort of allows that. Now, within reason, you have to be able to understand it, obviously. Incorporating a lot of feedback is also helpful. Having like a murkiest point at the end where you don't necessarily call out and say you don't understand. Some students don't ever say they don't understand something. So the murkiest point is where they take a minute and write down the thing they didn't understand, and they can give it to you. And the next class you can come in and reiterate that or talk with them privately about that. The Adaki assessment or a drop, add, keep, improve also is like that. It's a little bit more public though, where students are a part of the lesson plans and the activities, and if they're actually gaining from it or not. And so it's a way of assessing while you're teaching. And then creating, again, the safety and belonging feeling. I also like to start off the class with the in the air or empathy icebreakers. And this Binding It All paper has examples of this. But essentially where you have everybody on an even playing field, give them examples of adversity that they might face so they can talk about adversity and talk about how they've overcome it. So that everybody feels like, hey, everybody struggles, everybody faces adversity, versus the lone student that feels like they're struggling and thinks that everybody else is doing just great. And so in the study by Binding, it showed that these students that started with an icebreaker that allowed them to talk about adversity stayed in the classes longer, graduated, had better grades, and that it specifically incorporated minority students had better performance overall when this was integrated into the entire class. Along with this, mitigating competition for Indigenous students is actually quite helpful as well, because achievement is not seen the same way among Indigenous populations as in the Western world. You have humility in achievement. It's not something that you necessarily need to boast. And so you need to consider that competition-based strategies in teaching might lose interest and might not help the overall achievement of some students. And so there are no quick fixes to this. There's not a quick checklist of do all these things and everything's equal and everybody's happy. And in fact, you shouldn't always change things for every student. Everybody should have challenges that they face so that they can learn to adapt. But it's really about, first, for me, making the environment safe enough so that we can understand where we're going with inclusivity. So I can understand what your backgrounds are so that they can be included. It's not about incorporation of it's not about replacement of the Western way of knowing or your personal way of knowing and teaching. It's about incorporating others into it and everybody hearing each other. And so finally, and I'll probably put these in the chat too, these links, but I have in the Google Drive links to some resources and examples of assignments for both blind and low vision students, as well as things that relate to indigenizing pedagogies, and some literature and things like that. And these are live resources, and so they're editable. So please, if you have examples to include with them, other resources, it's just a place for, hey, if you're just faced with this for the first time, where can you go? And so I'll put those in the chat as well. And so I hope that I'll have some play in improving these, because most of these are just from my experience and a few other people. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was great. And you have tons of material that is going to be useful for people. I just wanted to mention, Sam, that we had a request for you to possibly share your PowerPoints. And would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, and actually one of them is shared, but yeah, I'll give you links, and they will be in those drive boxes as well. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yep.
I think there are already some questions out there and things people want to say, but because I want to make sure we get to our other speakers, we're going to go next to Nishan Borden. Nishan, do you want to start off?
Hello, everyone. So my name is Nishan Borden. I'm an assistant professor in the counseling department. I am a recent graduate of my doc program, and this is my first academic appointment. So I started at ISU last fall in the midst of a pandemic. I moved to Idaho from Florida. So a lot of big changes in a small amount of time. And I say that because I think a lot of my personal identities impact the way that I create an equitable environment in my classroom, right? Because students want to know me so they can feel safe sharing this information with me. So I don't have a PowerPoint. I had one that was like 3 slides, but Dr. Sam made that one that I don't want to share anymore. So I'll just spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about some of my experiences and really just reinforcing a lot of the things that Dr. Sam already shared with us. So definitely thinking about creating an equitable environment being an ongoing thing, right? So from my first class all the way into my last class, I'm checking in with students to see how is this landing with them? How does this feel for them? Do they feel safe in this environment? So I'm in the counseling profession, which is very different from STEM. It's all about feelings and communication. And in counseling, we are the tool, right? So the relationships that we build with our clients are really the mechanism for change. So when we think about training counseling students or counselors in training to go out and work in the community, we not only want to instill the core content of our profession, but we also want to see students be able to display the core dispositions. So we want students that are culturally humble, mindful, empathetic, engaging, curious, reflexive. So not only are we trying to create an environment where they can learn how to be a counselor and those skills, but also how to just be with people and make them feel comfortable. So from our first class, we're working on those things. So I was very lucky that I came into a program where that is already the culture. So I didn't have to build that culture from the ground up because those are things that are already happening. So from the very first class, and I'll use the cultural counseling class as an example, which is a class where we talk about how culture impacts the counseling relationship. So we're asking students to talk about their spiritual or religious beliefs or not, students who don't identify with any spiritual or religious group, their racial and ethnic identities, their social economic status, all of these different topics that students are not really used to talking about in a classroom environment. So from the first class, I am open with my positionality. I'm a Black woman, I'm in Idaho, I'm probably the first Black teacher you have ever had, right? So even though I have maybe marginalized identities in the culture of our society, in this environment, I am in a position of power as an instructor. So if we're gonna be talking about big topics like racism, students are scared that they're gonna say the wrong thing and offend me. So from the first meeting, I'm trying to lessen that power differential and say, look, we all make mistakes. Our goal here is to learn and to be honest and open about our feelings. I'm also asking students to talk about politics, things that people normally also don't talk about in class, because in the counseling field, the personal is political and politics impacts mental health outcomes. So I'm asking students not to say who you voted for, but how does this climate impact our clients, right? So I'm always trying to put it back into the context of our clients. And I think being upfront with what I think, it makes it safe for students to be able to share those things. So I also think about these ideas, equity versus equality, right? So I'm not trying to create an environment in my classes where every student gets the same thing, because that doesn't work, right? So I'm trying to create an environment where every student gets what they need. And an example of that is, I go back to this cultural course and we have students who, have very conservative religious beliefs and students who are completely on the opposite spectrum of that, and might feel marginalized or oppressed in their beliefs in that classroom, but they are not marginalized or oppressed in big society. So creating a space where students on both ends of the spectrum can talk about those things in some kind of middle ground, that's been important. So I talked a lot about, I want to model this way of being from our very first class. So I'm honest with students about how things make me feel, about when I'm uncomfortable, and I encourage them to do the same. Things that I do well. Students want to know when I was a counselor, they want to know times when I messed up, times when I got it wrong, because that makes them feel like they have permission to also make mistakes and get things wrong. So from the very first class, I'm working on ways to model this way of being that we are expecting from our counselors in training. Also, like Dr. Sam mentioned, I want to diversify the curriculum. So I want to include diverse voices from the counseling field in our syllabus. And I also want to include diverse mediums. So I have videos, I have podcasts, I have movies, I have guest speakers, right? So all of these different perspectives are being invited into our classroom so students can find different things that they can connect with. It's really hard. I found that it's hard for students to do all the reading, but if I put a podcast up, everyone will listen. That makes a big difference. I also try to make sure that I'm very intentional about taking assessment of student needs. So as I mentioned, I started teaching here in a pandemic, and students are really overwhelmed, not just with the course material, but also just with the state of the world. So I asked students, what would be the best day for you to turn in this assignment? It's no point in me having students turn in assignments on Fridays at 11:59 when I'm going to be asleep anyway, right? So I want to have a day that works best for the students. So even things like that I've found have made the environment feel more accessible and welcoming, especially for adult learners who have responsibilities outside of what they're being asked to do in our graduate program. Dr. Sam spoke to encouraging the voice of students from minoritized or marginalized backgrounds. And that's also something that I want to do, but I also want to do it in a way that it doesn't require extra emotional labor from students, right? I'm a Black person, but I cannot speak for all Black people. So I'm just giving you my experience with a certain thing. And I'm not calling on students to share their experience and put them in a position to further feel uncomfortable, if that's what that will lead to. So that's also important. And then finally, I just want to organically build in opportunities for students to have an opportunity to reflect on the criteria. I feel like with adult learners, it's really important when we are trying to install a new way of being or different things like that, that they have an opportunity to be challenged, but not to the point where that we lose them. So trying to find that middle ground where we are slowly incorporating this new material and into their way of being. So that's really all I have. I feel like that was really quick, but I'm gonna stop there. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was the perfect amount of time. It gives us lots of time for discussion at the end. Our final speaker is Mona. Mona, would you like to start us off?
Absolutely. My name is Mona Hearn, and I work with some amazing folks here at the College of Education, and I want to thank Dr. Appleby for inviting me to be a part of this panel. So today I'm going to speak about how to create and support equitable classrooms through the lens of anti-racism education, and specifically when it comes to the importance of anti-racism education in an elementary school setting. And the reason that I wanted to focus in this particular setting is because there's so many misconceptions about how young people view race and racism. Many people, we know that elementary education, those early years are foundational years, and how important it is for children to be exposed to people of diverse backgrounds and to diversity in general. But also many people believe that at this age, children just don't see color and they don't know what racism is. And there is all these misconceptions about it. We also know from the history of public education that elementary schools were really the very last frontier to desegregate. In many places in the South where people were against bringing people together in one field, they had allowed high schools to desegregate. However, in these high school settings, student councils were separated between Black and white students, and they had two separate proms. But the main focus and where the civil rights movement had to go was in the elementary schools, because if you want to really build a racial superiority in some children, you cannot allow them to be in contact and be friends with people of different races from an early age. So there was a lot of resistance and a lot of organization to not allow elementary schools to come together and be desegregated. And many scholars and researchers even believe today that since the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education court case, that many of our elementary schools continue to be stubbornly segregated. Even some data suggests that they're even more segregated now today than they were in the 80s. So this segregation persists despite a mountain of evidence demonstrating that students who attend school in integrated settings harbor fewer prejudices and have less discriminatory attitudes. And research also shows that attending a diverse school helps to counter stereotypes and leading students to seek integrated settings later in life. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of racism on elementary school children. So when studies have been held, when people have been asked throughout your educational life, when was the hardest time for you when it came to racism, when children of color were asked that questions? And they often said that the elementary school experience was often the most difficult for them to process that racism. And one wonders why, right? So at this age, children really repeat everything that they hear at home. So if there is racist conversations in this charged climate currently around the dinner table, they will bring that to school and they will share that and they wouldn't think about it. In most cases, children at that age do not question their parents' opinion. And because due to the smaller school sizes of our elementary schools, children of color often feel that they do not have friends who really know what racism sounds like or looks like. So they don't really have any friends who can defend them during those incidents. And also children of color often don't know how to defend themselves at that age. And often racism comes as a shock to their system. Now we need to look at some data and talk a little bit about the adultification of Black children. So in 2016, researchers at Yale determined that as early as preschool, so preschool is when children are 2 and 3 years old, educators tend to police Black children more severely than white students. In a nationally survey conducted by Ed Weekly Research Center, just in June of this past year, 87% of teachers, principals, and district leaders agreed that Black students face higher rates of school discipline than their white peers due to discrimination. And in part, this may be due to adultification of Black children, the well-established tendency for non-Black people to assume Black children are older than they actually are. Black boys in particular are seen as 4 and 5 years older than they are, according to a 2014 article published by the American Psychological Association. And in 2017, research from Georgetown Law Center confirmed that Black girls are also as older than they are, and they are less protected and are punished more severely in schools than white girls. So let's look a little bit at children and racial identity. Again, going to this idea, oh, children don't see color, right? So actually, at only 3 months old, children may look differently at people who look like or don't look like their primary caregivers. So from a very, when they're still babies at 3 months, they can see facial features, they can see color, and they can make that distinction, right? And at the age of 2.5, children can start developing and observing racial biases that they see in the world around them. So it already starts at that toddler age. And by age 4 and 5, they did these studies and they found that Black and Hispanic children show no preference towards their own group. They don't think, oh, my group is better than other groups, right? On the other hand, white kids remain strongly biased in favor of whiteness. And by kindergarten, children have already learned to associate some groups with higher status or more positive value than others. So when we look at children and identity and elementary school education, we know that in an elementary school setting, the virtues of kindness and friendship are very important. And of course, who could argue with that? How can you say there is anything wrong with kindness and friendship, right? We also know that children at this age are developing a sense of who they are. This includes, what is my race? What's my gender? What's my class? And all of those things, right? However, these identities, we know in our society, have never been treated or represented equally in our country. So when we teach about acceptance and kindness without addressing inequity, we gloss over crucial differences in ways our students experience the world. So one of the characters and heroes of our country, Dr. Martin Luther King, I feel as even racist people love to quote him on Facebook on Martin Luther King Day, right? So it's easy for us to study civil rights movements and really cherry pick quotes from Dr. King, as many people do, that just focus on everybody getting along, right? But we can also show students at that young age when they're studying the I Have a Dream speech that yes, Dr. King did talk about that he can't wait for a day when his children are judged by the content of their character, but also in the same speech, he refuses half measures towards equity, saying, no, we are not satisfied and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. So focusing on the dream of equitable future without teaching the reality of an equitable present kind of ignores the radical anti-racism work that Dr. King and others have been engaged in. So obviously we need to really promote anti-racism curriculum in our schools, especially in the elementary setting. And we know that historically our educational system has been founded on many racist practices, including silencing those from disenfranchised communities. And to build a just curriculum also needs to include teaching history in a responsible way, which still is not being done. And it also needs to ensure that the diversity of cultures in our country are represented and honored in our studies. But we know that it's not enough to simply have representation. Students must feel that their identities are validated and their school is a place that completely accepts them. And we need to really realize often we have a charity approach about teaching diversity or anti-racism education. And we need to realize that it's not just for students of color to see themselves in the literature or the history that they study, that students from all backgrounds need to hear those perspectives as well. And that we need to teach students with privilege not to have a savior attitude towards historically disfranchised communities, but rather to listen and to value and stand in friendship and kinship with them as we all work together towards a more just environment. I'm sure you have all studied, for everyone who is engaged in anti-racist work, the Bible of anti-racism education currently is Dr. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. And one of my favorite quotes out of the book is that there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. You're either on the right side of the history or the wrong side of history. There is no neutrality in any place in this. And the claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. An anti-racist is someone who's supporting an anti-racist policy by their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So continuing to look at this, they did just this past year, they did a study and they asked teachers if they have had training and resources they needed to teach an anti-racist curriculum. And only 11% of the teachers said that they did. So even as educators see the need to equalize and improve the educational experience for students of color, they might not have the tools or the support they need to address curriculum and practices at their school. So talking about teacher education programs that produce teachers that go into the world and take on those elementary schools and middle and high schools, our programs need to look at ourselves in a very honest way and ask ourselves if our students are really ready to create truly equitable classrooms that embrace the history and culture of communities. And these programs need to really make an effort to meet with Black, Indigenous, and other educators of color and listen to their experience as both students and teachers. For that, faculty should create, new courses and syllabi representing the best of an anti-racist teacher preparation program. So what do anti-racist teachers do differently? They studied and they're committed on deepening their critical consciousness by learning how to identify racism. It's always amazing how people can be in the same room and racist comments are made and it just goes over people's head. They can't even hear it, okay? So can you even hear? Can our children hear when they hear racism, identify racism? How racism is carried out and built in systems and structures, how people hold, sustain, and maintain racism, and how people of color can often internalize racism. And educators need to recognize that even the best teachers are not immune from bias, and that the goal of equity requires for all of us to look within instead of thinking, somebody give me a gold medal because I'm too great to hate, right? That we are above that. This education needs to be ongoing. Anti-racist teachers should be able to help children recognize when they see and hear racism, and they need to know what to do about it. Children of color need to know that their teachers will speak up, facilitate, and engage with them when they have experienced racism. And anti-racist educators understand that love and silence are deeply contradictory. Okay, so the experience of many students of color has been that when they have experienced racism, that often their teachers in that moment, they were just speechless. They didn't know what to say in that moment. And when doing work with racial trauma, children have often told clinical psychologists that the most hurtful moment isn't an actual threat, but when they realized the adults who were supposed to protect them had stayed silent. So anti-racist teachers, they continue to educate themselves on these issues. They really listen to families of color, to educators and students of color. They connect, they find and build groups for accountability within their institutions, but they also know that if you're engaged in anti-racism work, that you're gonna get attacked, that you're gonna receive backlash every time you open your mouth to talk about this issue. There's gonna be the angry emails and phone calls. So there needs to be a support system in place within every department where people can check on each other to make sure that they are okay while they are addressing some of these issues. And of course, using your power, whatever that power might be, to take action. And looking at, are people being left out? Does your administrator treat people unfairly? And all of those things. And this is one of my favorite images because it really allows all of us to look and ask ourselves, where are we in this path? While we are trying to become anti-racist, are we in the fear zone where we even deny racism is a problem or avoid hard questions? Are we in the learning zone where we recognize racism is a present and current problem and we understand our own privilege in ignoring racism, and we continue to educate ourselves on race and structural racism? And then of course there is the growth zone. Can I sit with my discomfort? Conversations on race and racism, no matter what age group, what setting, are always uncomfortable. Am I willing to still have them and be uncomfortable so I can grow out of that? And so it's always good to go back to this image and kind of ask ourselves, all right, where am I and what kind of work do I need to do in this process?
Thank you so much. Thank all of you for such thoughtful and rich conversations. Khalil, have you been monitoring the chat function here? And do you have
Yes.
any questions to start us off with?
Yes, I already forwarded one question to Samantha, and I'm sure she agreed to answer that question. Dr. Samantha?
Yes, so the question is about how to accommodate students that are maybe non-traditional or not like used to all of the new online things that we all have to do, now. And that is something that I think about every day now. I haven't taught much before COVID online, and so lately a lot of my thoughts have gone to how do I translate all of the things that I try to do online. And I think one of the things that I do with students who do struggle with the technology is I try to walk them through as much as I can, or point them into the right direction of someone who is way better at it than me. And also let them know that, it's not my ideal to be online necessarily either. And so I'm learning, and so let's walk through some of these things together. I also, for online classes, try to have as much interaction as you can possibly have in an online class. And I use Discord. And so on Discord, the students communicate a lot with each other, all day, every day, with each other and with me and with a TA. And so they ask each other questions and they share things that they find, or they can enter into chats themselves or with me. And so once I walk through, and you can use this on your phone and stuff, and so a lot of times I use Discord on my phone. And so I'll walk a student through how to use Discord, and once they get it, they also have all of their online classmates that they use as resources as well. And so that's helped me a lot in timing, because sometimes they'll ask me a question, but another student gets to it before I have to. And so, but for me, it's a work in progress, that I'm still trying to find ways to make the online situation work for the different types of students, and certainly for blind and low vision students, that's a very different game, and something that I'm still trying to consider. And I hope that other people have suggestions on this, but I try to just make everybody know that I'm very available, and so are your classmates. They're still there. So hopefully that sort of answers that question.
Thank you so much. And there's one more question from Hearn Medicine. Like in the beginning, Dr. Samantha, you talk about how important it is to bring the students in the classroom and make them feel welcome and included and all of those things. But what about international students, for example, or some of the students who are afraid to speak in the classroom because of the different environment? Could be language barrier, could be different culture. Any suggestion like how to work with those students to speak up in the classroom?
So that also, I think probably everybody struggles with that continuously. Another way I try to approach it at first is I have them talk about that problem, because as myself, I was a student that did not like to talk either, and so I let them know that, and that I totally understand, and I know some of the reasons why, and sometimes putting them into smaller groups helps them, because then they don't have to talk in front of everybody or in front of the instructor, that they're talking to their peers. And so I try to have opportunities like that, or I use other ways for them to get into a discussion. Like I've been using a software called Perusal, and you can make comments on the readings and they can talk to each other in sort of a chat type of way. And so that way they're talking still in class in a different way. I can see they're talking and they can engage in times when they don't necessarily feel like they can speak up or they need extra time, because I certainly have students that need more time than just talking real time in class. And so I find that something like Perusall has worked for me for that so far, just giving them another way of having extra time to think about what they want to say.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a couple of more minutes. Well, we don't have a couple of more minutes, but we can take at least 2 more questions.
Hello, it's Maurice.
Hi, Maurice.
Hey, it's more of a comment than anything. I just want to actually thank you for this presentation for all 3 panelists. Samantha was awesome. Her presentation was really good, and I can see how it can be used in other genres. Hey, Samantha, how you doing? And Nishan, her, I know she's new to the campus, but I think that she should be a great resource for people of color who are, seeking that PhD and so forth. And Mona, she was awesome. Like, I really liked her. I can really relate to, of course, being a Black male growing up in Los Angeles, how, teachers, how they treated us. And I really liked her research. So throwing it out there.
Thank you so much.
I have a question I want to throw out to really any one of you. I think you would all give potentially great answers to this. There's been, I work in an English department, and in the field of writing studies, there have been over the last 10 to 20 years, some arguments in favor of using a type of contract grading as a way of fighting racism, valuing labor rather than grading based on quality of work. And it's somewhat controversial. And I was interested in hearing any thoughts any of you have about issues relating to the ways in which we could potentially work to eradicate racism through the way we grade and assess student work.
So I've just found that it, in general, for all students, letting them have an expression from themselves versus giving them something more structured with points or something is better for them. It actually makes my relationship with them better and more open as well. And so I've had like rubrics and stuff where I use points and stuff too. And then at the end, there's always something that's missing from a rubric that I found and that I can't quite figure out how to correct for that. And so that's part of the problem that I have with using points. And I've started learning a bit about the entire ungrading system, which is not ready to go into, but I want to know more about it and how it works. Because of the fact that I really just feel like there's other means of expression, but that's just my point of view.
I'm not sure. This is Ann Hackard. I'm the Director of Assessment from the College of Business, and we have an accreditor who tells us that diversity and inclusion matters. However, what Margaret has pointed out is the talk and the reality can be very different. And so this is not something that I've seen in a lot of colleges of business as I've conducted research, but it's a really good idea to raise because, as Margaret pointed out, there can be some things inherent in how we're doing this that can mean that a side effect is to be not diverse and not have inclusion. So I would say we're not there yet in colleges of business, but I think it's a good point.
Nishan or Mona, did you either of you have any thoughts on this question? And it's okay if you don't.
I don't know about you, Mona.
I just have one comment to make, and that is institutionally, we're going through accreditation with the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities. And I'm gonna share in the chat a link with you, because guess what? This matters, and it matters not just, as I indicated, in an accredited College of Business program, but it also matters institutionally. So I just want to commend our presenters today for bringing up these fabulous ideas that the Academy really needs to hear. And I just got so many great ideas, but please, let's all leave here in our action item. Let's think about how we can incorporate some of these ideas in our own classes and encourage our colleagues to do that too.
Thanks, Anne. I also wanted to mention, we got a comment from Elizabeth Kirkham, who said she's had some success with ungrading, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about what you've learned.
Oh, certainly. So with what I've been doing with my upper division classes is setting up a system in which the low stakes assignments, and they have 1 or 2 of those a week, are scored on a satisfactory, unsatisfactory scale. And then at the midterm and at the final, they have a self-reflection and they argue for their grade. And at that point, they have to use their work in the class to demonstrate their learning and growth. So they can't just say, I earned an A because I think I earned an A. They actually have to point to specific examples in their discussions, in the content that they have produced, and argue and create a case for that grade. And so far, I haven't had anyone who has argued for a grade that they didn't actually earn.
Interesting, thank you. Any other questions from members of our session today?
I just want to say that I really like what Anne said, that we have to have an action item leaving this meeting today, and then talk with our coworkers, talk with our colleagues, and just pass this information to them. And some of the culture, I was talking with somebody from overseas, and then he gave me a very good idea of explaining a situation. He said, with one hand, we cannot clap. So in order for us to make a clap, we have to have 2 hands to make that sound, right? So, it doesn't take only one of us or one office or one department or one classroom. It takes all of us university-wide to help with this university equity and inclusion efforts, not only at work, but also in the classroom and also on campus anywhere. So.
Yes, in fact, Khalil, that's well said. I'm still thinking about the statistic that you shared, Mona, that only 11% of teachers had resources on anti-racist curriculums. That was a pretty powerful statistic. And I mean, for me, that one of the things that seems like a next step, something to think about, is how to create some additional resources for our community, for our larger ISU community, and try to improve that option here.
Yeah, we might. I think you've brought up a good point, Margaret, and I hope we can continue to think about that. And one of the things I was hoping I could find that I couldn't find at ISU was a site kind of like our OCR. How do you find resources for texts? I was looking at the library and hoping I might be able to find some, diversity and inclusion things there. So I think, Margaret, you just kind of made my wish out loud.
Well, and I think there are a lot of groups on this campus who are already doing a lot in that direction. And I think it's about maybe working together across colleges, units, divisions to try to find some central place to include these things. It's exciting. It's an exciting possibility. I want to give anybody who might still have one lingering question or comment that you wanted to say, that would be great. But if there isn't, I do want to mention that in a couple of weeks we are looking at another PI event. It's a session from Vanessa Ballum from the Department of Theater. We may be changing the date, so I'm not going to give all the details right now. We're in the process of considering that, but please do look forward to getting more communications about our next event. And thank you to all three of our speakers. I really appreciated all of the thoughts. I've taken pages of notes, and you've given me lots of good ideas. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Have a good day.